I'm still sitting on the bench. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Tears are still falling down my face, and I get a tap on my shoulder, and I look behind me, and it's J Mac's mother, and she's bawling her eyes out, and she whispers in my ear, "Coach, this is the best gift you could have ever given my son." Of course, I asked people, "What would you have done?" I cried harder. I was so touched.
Parenting is the hardest job, and there's not a close second. And parenting your kids who are athletes and performers provides a unique set of challenges. It requires you, moms and dads, to approach your relationships and interactions from a new perspective. I'm Nate Crandall, and along with my good friend and fellow certified high-performance coach, Steve Galley, we welcome you to the Stop Parenting, Start Coaching podcast. Together, Steve and I bring nearly 6 decades of wins, lessons, and plenty of scars. As coaches, teachers, and dads ourselves, we're here to help guide you through the shift from parenting to coaching. So, are you ready to level up and have some fun doing it? Let's go. In this episode, Steve and I are joined by a special guest you won't want to miss.
On February 15th, 2006, an autistic high school student stunned the world when he entered a basketball game in the dying minutes and proceeded to shoot the lights out. CBS, ESPN, and CNN and major news outlets around the world picked up the story. The YouTube video got millions of hits, and the world was fascinated with everything to do with J-Mac. But the story actually began long before he took the court that night at Greece Athena High School in Rochester, New York, when Coach Jim Johnson's sense of compassion led him to give an autistic, learning disabled team manager a once-in-a-lifetime chance. And how that boy seized the opportunity in such a stupendous way will not be forgotten anytime soon. A modern-day miracle took place that night, and it's proof that dreams really do come true. Our guest today, Coach Jim Johnson, has been on Oprah, ESPN, and the cover of People magazine. He's an author, motivational speaker, leadership coach, and a host on the podcast, which I will say is one of my favorite podcasts now, the Limitless Leadership Lounge, which we will talk about later. It's an excellent show for young and emerging leaders. But Coach's real genius, it is helping people unlock their full potential through the power of belief, discipline, and heart. So parents, you do not want to miss this interview. And Coach, we welcome you from New York to the show. And I do want to say this, that when we first met and we had I believe our first conversation was a phone conversation. This was about a year and a half or maybe getting close to 2 years ago. And we've talked since. I seriously thought that I was just talking to one of my old coaching friends and buddies. I felt like we had known each other for decades, and maybe it's just because we were in different parts of the world, but sharing some of the same experiences over time as coaches. I'm proud to call you my friend, and I appreciate your mentorship as well.
Absolutely. So, well, thanks, Steve and Nate. I'm really looking forward to this, and always love to talk about leadership, and certainly if we can help parents, that's always a good thing, right? So.
It is a good thing. Yeah. Coach, so let's go back to the beginning so our listeners get a little background on you. Why coaching? What called you to that path?
That one was pretty simple for me because my dad was my high school basketball coach. So, and he was my hero. Unfortunately, we just lost him last year, but he had 90 years on this earth, and he was just such a great model. And I was the oldest of 6 kids. So, I had 3 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters, and, sports was a big part of our life growing up. And, I played all kinds of sports growing up, but when about 8th grade, my dad took over at the high school that I was going to be going to, and I really started basketball became my number one love, although I still continue to play other sports. And I was in 8th grade. I was pretty humbled. I unfortunately got to show my age. That was the first time we ever had middle school sports. Was my 8th grade year, and
Wow.
I was a very, very small in stature and very skinny. I think it was about 5'5", maybe 90 pounds as a eighth grader. And even though I had some skill, as you guys know, being coaches for a long time, in the middle school, you get kids that have beards and you have kids that have a long ways from puberty. And so they didn't cut a lot of people, and I was like the 19th guy in the team. To give you an idea, I know they only had 15 uniforms, and there was 5 or 6 of us. I think they kept like 20 or 21 people, and I had a T-shirt with a number on. So I will say that was a little embarrassing, but it was a humbling start to my interscholastic career. But I loved basketball, so I started. And of course, my dad was the high school coach, so I was in the gym a lot. And my freshman year, I started on the freshman team, so I made some real progress. And then I went from a freshman to my sophomore year. I actually got brought up to the varsity, and I was like the first guard off the bench. And then my junior year, I got better. And my senior year, I was actually the best player in the team. I played 1 year of college basketball. I transferred and humbly got cut. But I kind of went off my beaten path. I was pretty driven. Unfortunately, I met my wife my junior year because I was doing a lot of partying. I wasn't really very focused, but hopefully, she kind of straightened me out. We've been married now for 42 years, and
Wow.
so that was a good thing. So after I got out of college, my dream was to be a high school basketball coach in my area. I would have loved my hometown. In fact, my first 3 years, I was a freshman coach and then a JV coach for 2 years at 2 of the Greece schools where I grew up. And then my break came, at least I thought that was the case, because I got an opportunity to take over a program. They were really bad. But in my mind, I had some winning teams at the younger levels. I thought I was going to turn this team from the outhouse to the penthouse in the first year. And after our first 2 games, we were 1-1, and I thought, okay, I'm all right. I got this. And then we proceeded with my great coaching wizardry to led that team to 17 consecutive. Yes, you guessed it, losses. And then I was in an interim position, and the administration decided to go in their famous different direction. So, in other words, I was fired, let go, however you want to call it. And that was a really humbling experience. And after I licked my wounds and blamed other people, after thinking through, I realized I had a lot to work on myself to become a better leader. And I also wanted to prove that I could be a successful coach. And I did get a break. The next year, I got recruited to coach a year as an assistant at a junior college. And the ironic thing, your listeners, they follow basketball, and I know you know the name. The guy's name was Bill Van Gundy. And at that time, I had no idea that his 2 sons would end up being head coaches in the NBA numerous times. His older son, Stan, that's on TNT now, actually was my age. He was a college coach. And his younger son, Jeff, that was a commentator for many years and now is back coaching in the NBA with the Clippers. He was just had started as a high school coach. But Coach Van Gundy really helped me really with some leadership principles of how to be organized as a coach. And that helped me immensely. But my dream was I really wanted to be a high school varsity coach again. The next year, I became a high school coach again at a smaller school. The funny part is you never know, because I did have a couple times where, there's a lot of people applying for these jobs that I got the job. But that was not one of them. I actually was the only guy that applied for the job. so, so I think by that fact, I got an opportunity to take over this small school. And I was from a big town, but this school was really into sports, especially football, but they liked all sports. And we did pretty well for 2 years. And then after that, I got an opportunity to come back to my hometown. In my last 27 years, I was a head coach at 2 other high schools from the one I didn't go to. And I coached 7 years at a school called Greece Olympia that was horrendous when we took over. But fortunately, we got it turned around after a lot of hard work and effort. And then my last job, that program, although they had been losing before we took it over, we were able to get that going quite quickly. In fact, we never had a losing season in the 20 years I was there. Ended up doing quite well, where we got a little bit into the J-Mac story, which we can delve in a little deeper if we want. But I will say this, just to close this long-winded answer of my chasing my dream as a coach was that, my different experience as a player, when I did a lot of reflection, I think would help me immensely as a coach, because I was a guy that barely made a team and didn't play. I was a guy that started but wasn't the best player. I was a guy that was the best player on a team. Then I was a guy that got cut from a team. So, those are pretty much all the different avenues that you see as a player. And I think that helped me immensely in really building relationships with players, because I was in all those different roles at one time as a player. So I understood what it was like to be the best player. I also understood what was to be probably the weakest player on the team. So, so that was a good perspective to help me, I think, as a coach.
Yeah, I love the response, because I'm of the belief that often high school coaches, especially young high school coaches, are sometimes set up to fail,
Mhm.
and some of them get run out early, and I think it's unfortunate. I love your story, Coach, of how you had that fateful first season, and then you decided to work on yourself.
Yeah,
That's incredible.
yeah. So thank you.
So I want to hear about the JMac story. I remember hearing about this on ESPN.
Yeah.
And it always stuck with me because I was on the front end of trying to become a high school coach as well. And it inspired me. Like, it was really meaningful to me. It's like, man, I want to be like that coach that gives this kid an opportunity. So take us back to the setup. What was it that led up to that moment? The conversations you had with JMac, what was the season like with him? Conversations with his parents. What led up to that night where you put him out there?
Sure. So Jason came into our program in 2003. Actually, as a sophomore, I did not know him as a freshman. We had a fairly big school. We had about 1,400 students, and I also taught phys ed. So I had not had him in class his freshman year or his sophomore year. So when he tried out for our JVs, my JV coach came during tryouts about 3 days in. He says, "Coach, I've got this young man. He's very small in stature. He was probably 5'6", 90 pounds as a sophomore in high school. He's not very good. He's on the autism spectrum, which I didn't know that much about back then. He's learning disabled, but man, he's got this big heart and he loves basketball. And I think he'll really be a good addition to our program." And I said, "Well, what do you got in mind?" He says, "I want to offer him the team manager's job and let him practice with the team." And that's what he did. And for people that coach basketball, I think most places in the country, the JVs and varsity usually play back to back. At least that's the way, pretty much through my whole career. So Jason would sit on the bench. I say that lightly because during JV games, he would get pretty emotional because he's getting to know all the players on the team. But it actually would always warm my heart after the JV game. One of our varsity players would always go out and straighten, because he always wore a white shirt and black tie to every game. And they'd straighten him out. And then he was much calmer for the varsity game because he didn't know the varsity players that well. And he didn't know me that well because he was going to all the JV practices. But I just admired his passion for the game and how much he was into our program, and he'd do anything. And so, but the thing that kind of got in your question, answering that question, is that after his sophomore year, he came to everything. And I was picking him up at his house, and he loved basketball, and so did I. So we were always talking basketball. So I was becoming very attracted to him just because we both had this great passion for basketball. He tries out his junior year for the varsity, and he's grown a little bit. He's up to 5'8", maybe 100 pounds. So he's
Really bulked up.
so anyways, during tryouts, I bring him in and I said, "J-Mac, unfortunately," and by the way, just to give you a quick little sidelight, I nicknamed him J-Mac because I couldn't pronounce his last name. In fact, butchering his last name was a misdemeanor. I would have been on death row. So anyways, I asked him one day in a JV practice if because we had, back then, there was a guy named Jerry McNamara that played at Syracuse, which is only about an hour and a half. And everybody called him G-Mac. So that's how I got the idea. And I named him J-Mac, and he loved it. So that, in fact, it was funny because as people started to know him as our team manager, almost everybody didn't know his name. They just knew him as J-Mac, even the kids in the school. But anyway, so his junior year, he I asked him to serve as our team manager, and he quickly embraced that. And I want to give you a quick context. So at that point in my career, I was kind of known as a guy that could win quite a bit in the regular season, but I couldn't win the big one, as you've probably heard in coaching. In fact, I had taken 5 different teams at 2 different schools to the sectional semifinal, but never even making the finals. So Jason's junior year, our first team meeting, I walk in, he immediately raises his hand. I said, "Yeah, J-Mac." He says, "Coach, we know you've never won the Section 5 championship." And I said, "Well, Jason, thank you for that reminder. I
Thank you,
appreciate
Jay.
that." So and then I said, but he tells me this year's going to be different. And I said, "Well, why is that?" He says, "Well, we've adopted this mantra called stay focused, and we're going to help you win your first sectional championship." Well, we have another good season. We get to the semis now for the 6th time in my career, and we lose at the buzzer to our crosstown rival, and we are devastated. I'm beside myself, and I don't think I'm ever going to do it. Although it was a great reminder, because my wife was very wise, and she said to me, "You always talk about your mission of helping people make their dreams come true. That doesn't mean you have to win this championship. It just means that you're a good model for the kids." And so it was a great perspective. So I did come back with a lot of vim and vigor for Jason's senior. Again, he came to everything. Now, another thing was very unique. He was the only player in my 30 years as a head coach that ever tried out 3 years in a row without making it. So his senior year, he comes out, and during tryouts, I bring him in, and I said, "Unfortunately, Jay, you're still not quite good enough to make the team." Our team was very good, and he had gotten a little better. At that point, he was 5'9", 115 pounds, I think. So, but I said, "Because of your commitment to our program, I want to give you a gift." And his head popped up immediately. He goes, "What's the gift, Coach?" I said, "For senior night, which is our final home game where we're going to honor the seniors, I'm going to give you a uniform and let you go through senior night and hopefully get you in the game." In fact, I kid people in my presentations. I always say, "I know when I mean periodically, I define it as about every other day, Jason, when they ask me about that uniform." So, well, the interesting thing, his senior year, we were expected to have a really good team. We had a lot coming back from that previous pretty good team. And we start out 2-0, and then adversity strikes. And it's a long story, so I can't get into it. But, my book that I know Steve has called A Coach in a Miracle, we go through the whole story of what happened. But the bottom line is, we can all appreciate this, is have you ever been on a team that was divided? And then I always ask people, did you reach your potential? And of course, the answer is no, and we were no different. In fact, in our next 5 games, after starting 2-0, we lost 3 of them. I didn't think we'd lose any of them, but we were just torn apart. And this was my leadership lesson. So after those 5 games, we were playing in a Christmas tournament at the biggest school in Rochester, and they were really good that year. And the reason I got in the tournament is because I thought we were really good, and I thought, it would be a great test for us. Well, in the opening round, we play another team, and we barely win, and we're still not playing well. In Fairport, the host school beats this team in the second game by 40 points. And we had beaten that team 2 weeks earlier in double overtime. So I'm like, oh boy, we're in trouble. And so I brought him in to a short practice, a shoot around for your listeners, which is usually we do that when we have days off because it was during Christmas break. And normally we usually go for an hour, and we'll do some shooting drills and go through some plays and get ready for the game. But I knew I had to do something different because we were in dire straits. So I shocked him. I didn't bring any basketballs out. I set the entire team in the bleachers, and I said to them, "Guys, I don't want to go to the game tonight." And they kind of looked at me. "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, unless we decide we're going to unite, Fairport's going to beat us by 50 points tonight." But the best thing I did, and this probably was a incredibly great thing that I did, but I didn't realize it until I started really thinking about it, is I became vulnerable. And I said, "Guys, I don't have the answers, but you do. And you got to be willing to share." And I waited. It seemed like 5 minutes. It was probably more like a minute. And finally, we saw players, shared some ideas. And then after that, it just got some momentum. And by the end, everybody had shared how we could unite the team. And we never brought a basketball out. that night, though, we played a great game. We didn't win, but we lost in overtime to Fairport. It showed what we could do. And then we got some real momentum. It wasn't perfect, but we started to unite, and we won 8 of our next 9 games going to senior night. And senior night was on February 15th. On February 13th, I gave Jason his first jersey. It was number 52. It was way too big. He was so good at it. Although I kid people that the rumor around school was he slept in it for 2 straight nights. He was pretty fucked up. So, well, you guys being coaches, but just to give you a scenario, that was probably the most touching, because I went through 30 senior nights as a head coach. But to see Jason embrace his parents before the game in uniform was probably one of the most touching things I've ever had. I mean, I choked up. I was just to see him instead of his white shirt and black tie. So the game begins. And we had a good student body. You know, we have a lot of videos. ESPN had a really neat video that I show in my presentations. And so in the opening tap, we had a good student body. They called themselves the 6 Men. And they start chanting, "We want J-Mac. We want J-Mac." I guess just in case I forgot. So because we had so much strife, I knew that I wanted to get Jason and I wanted to get him to score a basket, but I knew I couldn't put him in before I put everybody else in, because that would have created turmoil again. And so I didn't. And so I got everybody in except Jason. And so with about 4 minutes to go, I said, you know what, the time's right. So I stood up, I pointed to him. He nearly ran on the court. He was so excited. And then he walks on the floor. And what happened next, again, touched me deeply. Our student body gives him a standing ovation. They're so pumped up. But what Jason and I didn't know, one of our parents, he was kind of our unofficial photographer, he had all these pictures of J-Mac's face, and he put them on paint sticks like a placard, and he gave them to the student body. So when he walks on the floor for the first time in his career, I see all these pictures of Jason. I get so emotionally distraught. I sit down and tears are rolling down my face. I can't believe how the students greet him. Well, he's in his first game. First time he touches the ball, he's got a 3-point from the right corner. And I tell you, we had a pretty good crowd there. It was probably close to 1,000 people. Our gym seats like 1,200. And he shoots it. I could see around me the whole crowd stand up. And Nate and Steve, he misses by like 6 feet. And this is a public school, and I kid people that I know you're not supposed to pray in the public schools, but I was praying, dear God, please help him get one basket. So, well, the next possession, he has a much shorter shot from about 10 feet, which you don't see on many of the videos, but it hits the rim this time. So I'm thinking about, all right, God's starting to listen. We're getting closer. So the third possession, he has another 3-pointer, this time from the right wing. He lets it go. And it goes in. The place just explodes. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, God must be a basketball fan. Not only has Jason scored, he's got a 3-pointer. Getting you better than this, right? I'm going to fast forward and then come back and just share a couple of quick points. 6 months after that game, Jason's at the ESPY Awards, the ESPN Awards. He's up for the greatest sports moment of the year. And his idol was the late Kobe Bryant. In fact, Jason used to sign his name, Jason J. Mac Kobe McElwain. That's how much he liked Kobe Bryant. And so, well, I kid you not, at the ESPYs, one of the other finalists for the same award was Kobe Bryant. Kobe had scored 81 points in an NBA game for the Lakers that year. So he meets his idol and he beats him up for the ESPY. Well, how does he do that? Well, after the first 3, he comes down, he makes another 3. Then he makes a basket where his foot is on the line. That was his only 2-pointer. And then he missed a couple and he made a couple. And the place is just in pure bedlam. And the 2 things I'll never forget, with about a minute to go, I'm still sitting on the bench. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Tears are still falling down my face, and I get a tap on my shoulder, and I look behind me, and it's J-Mac's mother, and she's bawling her eyes out, and she whispers in my ear, "Coach, this is the best gift you could ever give my son." Of course, I asked people, what would you have done? I cried harder. I was so touched. Then this is how the game ends. Now, if we ever get a movie, they'll probably embellish it some, but this part did happen. Our Spencerport, our opponent that night, they score with about 10 seconds to go, and we were up quite a bit. In fact, Jason, because of all his points, made the spread a lot worse than it was when he got in the floor. But so anyways, our player takes the ball out of bounds. And instead of throwing it to our point guard, which he normally does, he throws it to J-Mac. So he's dribbling down. I look up at the clock and it's clicking down 6, 5. I'm thinking they're just going to let him go in and make a short shot, a layup, right? Oh, no, he pulls up like 2 feet behind the arc. I'm thinking, Jason, don't shoot from there. You're going to ruin this moment. He launches this rainbow. Swish. I look over, the whole gym runs on the floor like the Rudy story. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm living Rudy, but this is really true. And then I'll never forget our players put Jason up on their shoulders, got the game ball over his head. And at that point, I had no idea how many points he had. And our public address announcer comes on and says, the leading scorer for Greece Athena tonight, J-Mac with 20 points, including 6 three-pointers. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it was crazy. And I'll close this part by saying one of the coolest things was I mentioned earlier how much strife we had. And I knew our players liked Jason, but I wasn't sure how they were going to respond, him getting into the game. And yet all those last 4 minutes, the 4 players on the floor, I never asked them to pass the ball. They did that out of their own hearts, which to me is the essence of teamwork, when you shine the light on one of your teammates. And it was so cool that they did that on their own and really kind of propelled us to the next phase, which we can talk about how we close the season, which was pretty cool too.
Yeah, go ahead. Tell us how we did finish, how you did finish.
So after that game, just to give you a perspective, I was not a marketing person. So, I was so touched. And back then, the one thing that I had to do with the media is, we had no press conference, any of that kind of stuff. But, we had to call it into our local newspaper. So when I called it, and I was all pumped up, and I said, hey, our team manager scored 20 points. I thought for sure the writer would, do a little story in the newspaper. The funny part is we got a headline the next day, but it said Trojans, our team nickname, ties for division title. And it mentions briefly, but it doesn't do much. So I walked in the next day at school, and there's a buzz around school. In fact, I got to admit, I didn't do much teaching in my phys ed classes. We watched the video over and over again. And kids would come up to me and say, Coach, this is going to get on ESPN. I said, ESPN? And we got headlined in the Democrat and Chronicle newspaper. So, but what happened really was Jason's speech pathologist. I didn't know him very well, and it was the only game he ever came to, is that he was so touched, he called one of our local TV stations. Of course, back then it was a VHS cassette tape we had. And one of our local TV stations borrowed it. They showed that night. And within 2 days, it just erupted. We were getting calls from all over the world. It was crazy. And now Jason, because in our area, you have to play 6 regular season games to qualify for the postseason. And of course, he only played in 1. So he's got to go back as team manager. But yet he was so fired up. And so we end up, we had a high seed, so we ended up the 2nd seed. We got a bye, and then we were in the quarterfinals. We won that pretty easily. And so my big test was my semifinals. Is that I learned because one of my big things in my mission was to be a great role model. But I did a lot of reflection because we lost all these tight games, in the semifinals. And what I realized, I was putting so much pressure on myself to win that semifinal game, that I was a different person. And because I was putting so much heat on my players, because of my lack of emotional control when things would get tight. So I made a pact with myself after Jason's game and going that I was going to be the rock no matter what happened. And I did get tested because after the quarters in the semifinals, we were ahead by 10 at halftime. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're finally going to do it. We implode in the 3rd quarter. We're actually losing in the 4th quarter. But this time I was calmer. The kids responded. Jason was encouraging them. And we actually rallied and won the game. And so we were going to the finals. And I will say the next 3 days, we had between the semis and the finals, there were 3 school days. And it was like a mini Super Bowl week. We had a Japanese TV station come to the school. It was crazy. And of course, now we're trying to prepare for that championship game. Well, in our area, sports people like, but it's not like a hotbed like Indiana where, they're selling out our arena for a high school game. So we do play in, our big arena, which seats about 10,000 for the championship game. We into the arena. And normally we get between 3 and 4, sometimes 5,000 of people are interested in the game. We walk in the arena, it's sold out because we had so much attention. So there's 10,000 people there. And needless to say, I thought we were ready until 4 minutes into the first championship game I ever coached. We're down 14-3. I'm like, oh boy, that's not right. But again, great leadership lesson I want to share with people is I was much stronger, and I encouraged and told them, we just got to do what we're planning to do. And the kids hung tough, and we actually got down last minute. We had tied the game, and then we have a shot clock, so it was a 45-second, I think, back then. And so we couldn't run the whole clock down. So late in the shot clock, our point guard penetrated in a tie game, threw it out to one of our other guards, and he makes a three. Our opponent comes racing down, they miss a three, and there's a scramble. All of a sudden, they got tackled by my JV coach. We won the championship for the first time. And I'll give you a quick little sidelight because we were getting so much media attention and people wanted to represent me and stuff. And I'll never forget this one lawyer saying, well, coach, it would really help the story if you win the sectional championship. I go, that's what I need, more pressure, right?
Thanks.
Yeah. So, so that was a pretty cool thing that, kind of ended there. It was kind of the cherry on top because certainly the JMAC game was the greatest thing that I ever had in my coaching career.
Wow. That's amazing. We got a little bit of the before, the during, and the after. Coach, what are you most proud of?
Well, you know what? I mean, the JMAC game was certainly my proudest moment in coaching because I felt really good that I gave a young man. But one of the things that I want to share with people is he deserved the chance because he put the work in. He was a giver first. He served the program in any way he can. So, I really want to. Because I think there has been a ripple effect. I see stories and they touch my heart. When I see a young man or young woman, this has some kind of challenge and it gets an opportunity. So I think that's great. But I think the other thing is what I learned from Jason is you got to be ready for your opportunity and deserve that opportunity. From a standpoint, like personal is that, I'm proud that I've been married for 42 years and we have a son that's, done extremely well. He's a lawyer. Both my wife and I were teachers, so he's way above us. From a coaching standpoint, my second to last year was the best team we ever had. Jason volunteered in our program for our last 9 years, so it was pretty cool. And we beat a team that had two players that have actually played in the NBA. So it was a pretty good team. In fact, Ty Jerome plays for the Cavaliers. He's still playing. So, so that. But I'd say overall, you always as a coach, you want consistency. And what I am proud of is, my last 23 years in coaching, we didn't have a losing season. That we were pretty darn consistent. And, that really got into a lot of the leadership principles and things I try to teach people on, developing systems and how you can be consistent.
So most of our listeners are parents of teen athletes and performers.
Yeah.
You've had hundreds, maybe even thousands of interactions with parents over your 3 decades plus of coaching. How do we help parents focus on the connection with their athletes instead of performance, pressure, and results?
That's a wonderful question. What I've observed, because I learned a lot from my parents, both what to do and what not to do. And I think it helped me immensely with my wife and I in raising, I think, a really good son, is that number one is I really encourage parents to love their children, but not live through their children. I think that's a really big mistake that I've seen a lot where, they put so much pressure on their son and daughter that they've got to be a great athlete or a great performer, whether it's singing or being in a theater or, even grades, instead of saying, I'm going to love you no matter what. I'm going to support you and really be there for you. And the thing that I really encourage parents is that you got to be the model for your children. And so that is because, you've heard this adage, but I think there's so much true that your children learn so much more from what they catch as much as you teach them, because your model is going to teach them immensely, either good or bad, depending on. So I think that's the thing, that because we used to really emphasize our players. We told them all the time, you are always on stage. And that was the thing that it was great for me, because I became a much better coach when I understood that for myself.
Yeah.
That how I model, how the good and the bad. And so that's something I really encourage parents, is that you got to love your children, be there for the children, but not live through the children in that, no matter what. Like, it's funny, we have one child, and, my wife and I both we're phys ed teachers and coaches, and my son didn't like sports. So figure that one out. I mean, he played some sports, but he was a straight A student. In fact, I kid people that he graduated summa cum laude, and I graduated thank you laude. So so he was a great student, and I mean, he got straight A's through high school, college, and law school.
Wow.
And so, I mean, he's bright, and now he just became partner at his firm, so he's doing really well. But I think that's just something I really encourage parents is, help guide your son or daughter to find out what they love to do, and then encourage them, but not put so much pressure on them that the results are got to be there, because they'll do that on their own. Like, my son put a lot of pressure on himself to be a great student, because he knew we took a lot of pride in that. But we were not going to love him less if he came down. He did have one B plus in high school. It was his freshman year. So, which again, for me, a B plus I thought was always very good. So,
So I want to tap into a little bit of the consulting side of you here, and I'm going to give you a
yeah.
scenario. So kids, by the time they're in high school, they're often driving themselves home. They go out with their friends after the game. And so you hear a lot about the car ride home. I'm going to put you on a car ride home with a parent. The kid's not in the car. You're in the car with the parent after a really tough emotional game, win or lose. What are you coaching them on as they drive home for the conversation they're going to eventually have with their kid?
But the thing I learned, and I didn't do this very well early in my career, because I did it much better with my parents and much better with my players, my staff, is I think leaders are the CQA, the chief question asker. And I think that's the huge thing as a leader, is if you want to get the most out of, whether it's parents, players, my staff, is that questions like, well, how do you feel with what just happened? And then have empathy and really just listen to what they say. And that will usually dig down into some deeper questions that you can get into, trying to figure out how they feel about things, their perspectives on things. Because, I always kid people, I was an educator for over 3 decades, and the 3 R's in education is not reading, arithmetic, and writing. It's relationships, relationships, relationships. And when we forget that, both as a parent, as an educator, that's when I think we struggle. So the best thing that I learned that helped me immensely, so I can't give you an exact scenario, other than I'm going to just start with basic questions like, how are you feeling about that? What's the best way I can support you? And just get them to talk. And then after you hear their answers, that's where empathetic listening. So you're really listening to what their answers are, so you can ask more deeply questions to really get to what the root of what they really want out of their lives. And then as you get them talking, then you can sprinkle in some advice.
Yeah.
And even asking them, sometimes you got to ask them hard questions after you build that relationship with well, do you think you're being a great model for your son or daughter? And then you stop and just let them think about that. Now that's not the first question I'm going to ask them, because then it's going to get very defensive. But as you build their relationship, just to get them to think about that. So
What helped you get better as a question asker?
just I really, in fact, I've been retired teaching and coaching for 9 years, and I still to this day, I know Steve mentioned our podcast. But that whole podcast, the genesis was thought of is I wanted to give back to young leaders, because, as I mentioned earlier, at 25, I was a head coach, and at 26, I was no longer. And so I really became a student of leadership. And the more that I learned about leadership, I realized that the best leaders develop other leaders. And if you're going to develop great leaders on your team, between your staff and your players, then you got to be someone that's going to be curious and ask questions and understand humility. And because I think the things I've observed about, as I got better as a leader, I became more confident, but it wasn't cocky and arrogance. And I think that's where people struggle is that you can be confident, but you also have to have humility. And, you got to have empathy and understand and really get to know people. One of the things I really encourage leaders, is one-on-one meetings. I think those are often neglected because that's how you get to know people. But in those one-on-one meetings, it's not just about how they're doing with their goals or meeting standards. It's a lot about how am I building relationships so I can help that person in reaching their goals. Like one of the things that I share is that helped me immensely is when we always had a team goals meeting and we'd go over our mission and stuff at my house. And after that, though, the best thing that I learned was then we taught them how to set our players how to set goals. Then I met with every player one on one, and I wanted to find out about their goals and what they felt their role is, and how their goals were going to help us accomplish our team goals. And so that was a great opening way that I can learn about how we can work together. And sometimes, I had to tell them things like, a kid would come in and say, well, I think I'm going to be a starter. And I said, well, right now I have you as the 11th man. So we're not on the same page here. But then I'm going to share, my reasons why and what they would need to do, and and try to keep that constant contact. It's funny, just to give you a quick story. So the year I told you that we beat that really good team, we had the best team in the state, but we lost our second best player. He was a 5-year varsity player. He actually played as an 8th grader, which is pretty, because we were in a pretty big school. So, to play as an 8th grader, it tells you he was a 3-time all-grader Rochester. It means he was a top 15 player at Rochester 3 years in a row.
Wow.
The senior year, we're rolling, and he breaks his arm, and he's out for the rest of the season. And we were so good, we still made the state championship. We lost in the finals. But the cool thing is that to see how that young man handled it and was such a great leader, even though he couldn't play, was a great example for all the rest of the players. He was there every day supporting his teammates. And, because we always talked about we over me, but some guys don't buy into that very well. So that's something you really got to do. And that's why I think one-on-one meetings are so essential.
That's awesome.
Actually, can I just share one thing about going back to that young man that got hurt? The one point I wanted, one of my key points in my dream speech is carpe diem, which of course seize the day. And there was this one player, he was like our 9th guy, and he was really struggling because he wasn't playing much, and he was a pretty good player. We just were really good that year, and he was playing behind guys who were like in the top 15 players in Rochester. But when our young man Jay got hurt, he ended up starting, and in the state semifinals, he scored 12 points. Now, here's a kid that going until our young guy got hurt, he hadn't scored 12 points the whole season.
Wow.
So it just gives, everybody is, if you keep staying with it and working, you just never know. Obviously Jason was the greatest illustration. He never played. He scored 20. But, the bottom line is what I really try to encourage young people is you got to give it your best every day and then be ready to seize that day when your opportunity comes.
I love it. I'm on the sidelines too now, Coach, and occasionally I think about if I was coaching today, is there anything that I would do differently? And, we have a lot of parents listening. If you were to go back and coach again, which I would say you're crazy if you do, but if you were to go back and coach again, would there be anything that you would communicate to parents that maybe you wish you had done more of, or would you do anything differently as far as your communication with parents?
I think at the end of my career, we were pretty good at it, but I think the one thing is I would just keep trying to do the best I can to build relationships with both my players
Mm.
and parents. And that's something that I became much more cognizant because, I think one of the things that um, I think young coaches, when I observed, is they are almost like it's the parents against them. And you know what? Well, we've got to, if you're going to have a really good program, it's got to be everybody in together. Now, not everybody's going to agree. That's fantasy world. But like I'll give you an example. We had a parents players meeting every year, and an idea I got from one of my mentors that helped us immensely is in our program we had three school teams. So we had a ninth grade team, a JV, and a varsity. And at those parent players, every player and at least one parent or guardian was there, and then all the coaches. And we sat at seven tables. And one of the best exercises we did was we called it share what the other two groups should do. So what the concept was is the varsity parents, the JV parents, and the freshman parents would sit and talk about what were their three most important expectations for the players and for, in my case, because I was boys basketball, so it would have been their sons, and for the coaching staff. And then the three teams would write out their three most important things for their parents and the coaches. And then the coaches, it was the parents and the players. And then we would have someone from each, be the spokesperson, and they would share what their three highest expectations for the other two groups. And, it certainly didn't make everything perfect, but when you get everything out there, and these are our expectations, that helps you immensely in trying to meet each other's needs. And I just thought that helped us immensely. As again, it wasn't like, where nothing ever went wrong. I mean, that's unrealistic. But it did really give us clarity, because I always talk to leaders that clarity and communication is kindness. And when you lack that, that's where you run into trouble.
I really love that. And I know Nate has some leadership questions for you. He's taught leadership classes, and I've learned a lot from him. But I wanted to do a little plug for one of my favorite podcasts, which is your podcast. And I think it would help our listeners, many of them who've maybe have never heard it. I am fascinated by the format of this. You call it a tri-generational podcast.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the Limitless Leadership Lounge.
Yeah, so I mentioned quickly. So the genesis was because of my fact that I lost my first varsity position. So I wanted to give back to young emerging leaders. But I also wanted to get perspective, not just from me. So I went to a college professor. She's actually left education, but a female. And I spoke at her college a number of years ago, and we became friends. And she's originally from Bangladesh, came to the United States to get her doctorate at Penn State, and then she was teaching at a SUNY, a State University of New York school called Brockport, that was about 30 minutes from where I grew up. And so I met her and we became friends. And then this young guy that actually went to the high school where I retired from, but I actually met him. I've become an avid tennis player late in life, and I met him playing tennis. He was playing with one of my colleagues, and we've become very close. He's almost like a second son. I went to his wedding. He lives in my neighborhoods, and we do a lot together. And so I wanted to give a perspective from three different people on what leadership's all about, and then also want to interview great leaders and get their perspective on advice, like how can you help a young leader get off to a good start, and just teaching them different principles I think is really important. Because I have some beliefs, like I do a lot of leadership presentations, and I have 7 keys that I talk about. But I think the best leaders, and we hear this all the time, but I think a lot of us don't do this. And I know I'm just an avid want to be a learn-it-all and not a know-it-all. And so I am a junkie. Like, I encourage people that you should have a personal wellness, or not only wellness plan, but a personal growth plan where you're intentional. Like, I feed my mind on average about 90 minutes every single day. And it's through listening to podcasts. I read a book a week. I didn't do that when I was coaching. I was probably reading 15 or 20 books, but now I'm not coaching, so I'm not putting that kind of time in. But I'm just curious. I'm just always fascinated. What makes great leaders and what makes bad leaders? And there's some certain principles that I believe in, but I'm always open to, how can we make it better? And that's something, because one of the things I get this a lot. I speak to business, I speak to, schools and that kind of thing. And they'll ask me, Coach, you talked about in your, your steps, how to build a great program. Okay. But the other question is, because you see this a lot in athletics, you certainly see it in the music world, the famous one-hit wonder. Coach, how do you maintain consistency at a high level? Because as I mentioned, Steve, you asked me, being proud of. Well, in our sectional tournament, my last 17 years, we made the semifinals or better 17 straight years in a row. And in my last 11 years, we made the finals of our tournament 8 times and won 6. And so, but when I really share to leaders, if you to maintain that consistency, it starts with your curiosity. That, at whatever you did, you learn from it. But I teach leaders you need to do an autopsy on what you did well and what you didn't do well. Because you hear this all the time, and there's a lot of truth to it. You learn a lot from your mistakes, right? Probably more than you do from your successes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're going to build a great system, you got to start understanding what makes that a great system, and certainly you're always tinkering at it, but there's some certain fundamentals. We hear that in sports all the time, that you're going to try, if you're going to teach your players to be great players, they got to be able to pass, shoot, and dribble. If they can't do those things, you're not going to be very good. I would have coaches, Coach, how come all your guys can, pass, shoot? Because we worked with all of them. It didn't matter if you were 6'6" or 5'9". We wanted you to learn how to dribble. We wanted you to learn how to pass. We wanted to learn how to shoot. And that's what made our teams really good. When we started really having that philosophy, we were going to teach our players to be the best players they could be with their skills.
So I'm fascinated by the 7 keys of leadership, because anytime you get somebody that's put the effort, energy, all that learning and everything, you've created a core philosophy. There's so much we can learn from that. I'm very interested to hear what your 7 keys to leadership are.
So, number 1, I call it clarifying your vision. And one of the things that I really teach leaders is, I'm really big, and you guys from Utah, you would know this very well. One of my favorite books that I read many years ago that made a huge impact was 7 Habits by Dr. Covey. And in that, he talked about having a personal mission statement. And I got to admit, I had no idea what he was talking about. So, and I was just kind of going day by day, and he really opened my eyes. And, he talked about discovery, and he gave some steps, and some things, steps I give people that I think, and a couple of steps I did is I asked this question a lot: why was I put on this earth? Or, because I'm a person of faith, why did God put myself on this earth? And that's a really good question to contemplate. Then the second part of that is getting clarity of what your 3 most important values are. And then what I teach people is that with your most important values and why you think you were put on this earth, try to put in a statement. To give me an example, my mission statement is to be an outstanding role model that makes a positive difference in the world by helping others make their dreams come true. So that's what I'm all about. And that's what I'm trying to live every day. Now, I'm far from perfect, and some days are much better than others, but that's the concept. But that's the first thing, because I always kid people, if you can't lead yourself, very hard to lead others. So having clarity, your personal mission statement, your core values. And the second part of clarifying vision is getting a team mission, or a business mission, or a school mission, whatever it happens to be. And as the leader, like our mission, I remember when I took over my second program and we started to get into mission, I said, guys, what's our mission? And they come off a 2-win season. So they're like, Coach, we want to win. And I'm like, well, I want to win too, but it's got to be bigger than that. And so we created this mission that we kept through all the programs that I coached. It was we were going to develop winners on and off the court. And what I encourage leaders is you're the CRO, the Chief Reminding Officer. And that means you got to live the mission and you got to share the mission consistently. And so our players knew what it meant to win on the court. Winning the game was part of that, but being a great sport, being a terrific teammate, those are important. Off the court was being the best student you could be, being a person that contributed in a positive way to our community. So those are the things we were trying to teach on winning on and off the court. And so that's what I teach leaders there. Number 2 is building trust. Now, I've spoke to groups all over the country, and I always ask this question. Is trust essential in building great team culture? You guys probably guessed it's 100% hands up. Okay, everybody agrees that trust. But this is my challenge to them. I said, well, then, do you have an intentional plan on how you're going to build trust? And then we get a lot of blank stares. So I talk about when we took over our programs, I taught our coaching staff and then our players that we had what we call our 3 keys to building trust. And what you got to do is determine what's most important to you, because there's a lot of ways you can build and break trust. But our 3 keys, just to give you an example, would be we must align our words and actions. So if, as the coach, we practice at 6 o'clock in the morning, I better be there before 6 o'clock in the morning because I'm setting an example, aligning my words and actions. Okay. If I expect our players to be under control in a game, I need to be under control. That was something I didn't do very well in early in my career. I became much better, and that I think helped me immensely because I became a better model. So number 2 with that is we really focused on telling each other the truth. Now, I teach leaders that I think that's an art and science, because there are some players, as I got to know, I could call them out in front of the team and it would be a great example and it would work. There's other players that could not handle that. So that was one-on-one then. That's why, again, I say one-on-one. And then the third thing is, I took over 4 programs. They'd all been losing. The first one, as I mentioned, was a disaster. The other 3 we were able to turn around. Is that I think you got to come in with a mindset, because often as a leader, not always, but often you come in and take over something because it wasn't working, right? It was bad. And so I really teach leaders, you got to catch people doing right. And when you say catching and doing right, you got to be specific with praise so they have clarity. Clarity is kindness. So for example, instead of saying nice job, Johnny, or nice job, Susie, they like that, but they have no idea why you're really praising them. But if I say, hey, Johnny, that was awesome how you dove on the floor for that loose ball. That's what championship players do on championship teams. Now there's a lot of clarity because we know when there's specific praise that when you share it, that behavior is going to get repeated, which is what you want. And that's part of the mission is getting behaviors that you want repeated and behaviors you don't want not repeated. So the third thing is what I call creating an edge. And I think as a leader, we talked about this, is curiosity. I encourage people to have their own personal learning plan. Like I'm a big journal guy. I write down ideas all the time. I share them on my social media all the time. So I think it's really important that you keep growing. And that's what I mean by creating an edge. You got to keep learning. Otherwise, you're going to get passed by. There's no question about it. Number 4 is effective communication. We talked a lot about that. One of the things that I really emphasize leaders, and again, I was poor at the beginning of my career. I was not a very good listener. I was more of a know-it-all instead of a learn-it-all. And that when I became much better of really trying to focus on building relationships and being a much better listener. And to do that, that's why you got to ask questions. You got to constantly ask your team questions, individual questions, and really getting to learn. And like a little thing I do sometimes in my presentations that we used to do with our team is we would do a team wrap around where we said, answer this, if you really knew me, ... And then our players would share something that maybe no one on our team knew that. We did that a few different ways. One way we do it is just wrap it around the whole team. Another way we do it is in partners. And then the partner had to share what he learned from his teammate to the whole team. So now you're listening, and now we're working on communication. Because I think as a leader, being a better public speaker is very helpful. I don't think I know there's some really good leaders that aren't great public speakers, but I think it is helpful because one of the things I kid leaders is I think you have to be the chief storyteller in communication. And one of the things that I got pretty good at was I was a storyteller of giving stories of both warnings and examples. And I would, players that they were new during the era when I was coaching them, I would bring up a player that maybe was a great player, but I'd say, how come John Jones, I won't pick on any player, how come his teams never win, even though he scores 25 a night? And we tried to describe that, because he's what we call a ball stopper. He's selfish. He doesn't pass the ball. He cares more about his stats than he does about the team wins. And then I would give another example. How come this other guy, he's got similar numbers, but his teams always win? Because he doesn't care whether, like the greatest compliment going back, I'm bouncing around here, but that Jay that got hurt, he had a game one time, and he was our second or third leading scorer, but he scored 2 points. And we crushed this team. And I remember the other coach say Jay was so good because he made everybody else better. And he scored 2 points. But that's about as great a compliment as you can get on that. Number 5 is simple, but not so easy to do, and that's lead by example. So if you don't lead by example, you're always on stage. I think it's very hard to be an effective leader. Number 6 is my leadership philosophy. We call it leave a profit. And simply what that means is we taught our players everything we touch, we want to make better, not worse. In other words, everything we touch, we want to turn to gold, not garbage. I give a quick illustration. When we went to another school, when we walked in the locker room to change, if I saw a piece of trash on the ground, I would always ask, what do you think I did? And, it's not some noble thing, but I picked it up because what was I teaching our players? Everything we touch, we want to make better, not worse. And that, starts with just little small details like picking up a piece of trash. And then the last one is something that I really become a big student of now. And I really encourage leaders is what we call the servant leadership, which has gotten bigger now. And I define that as, the old pyramid of leadership was the leader was on top and everybody served the leader. And I think if you flip the mindset, now that doesn't mean, because I think people get caught up that servant leadership is soft leadership. It is not. The best servant leaders are tough. They're demanding, but they care. And they want to help their people succeed. So there's 2 things I say is you flip the pyramid so that your mindset as the leader, I'm serving my team, each individual. And number 2 is I believe the best leaders develop leaders. And that's why I always admired Bill Walsh. If you look at Bill Walsh's coaching tree, oh my God, it's incredible. All the head coaches that he's led. And to me, that's what it's all about. And the same thing, you guys both have been coaches. When your players lead the team, those are your best teams.
Yep. Coach, what's the best leadership book you've read that's had a profound impact on you? The most profound impact?
I have been asked that question, and that's nearly impossible for me to answer because I've just read so many good ones. Like I loved the 1 Minute Manager. That was another one that really, Ken Blanchard, Spencer Johnson. So because it's so simple yet it's so profound. I think that there's just there's so many good books out there. So I've taken so many good things from different people. So that like I'm a big John Maxwell fan. I've read a lot of his books. The 21 Irrefutable Laws.
That's foundational.
Just an unbelievable, great book. I've admired Simon Sinek's book. Starts with Why, and Leaders Eat Last. I think is a great one. One of my friends in speaking, he's a Hall of Fame speaker. His name is David Horsiger, and he studies trust. And his philosophy, and it makes a lot of sense, going back to I was talking about trust plan, is that he thinks all good and bad in leadership is all based on trust. If you
Right.
have good trust, things are going to happen in a positive way. If you have bad trust, break it down. So he has a couple of really good books. I like Patrick Lencioni's work. He runs the Table Group because he runs he's written a lot of stories. I'm always amazed with people that are so creative because he writes them as like fables, but they're
Yeah.
such great stories, and
Yeah.
how they come up with that.
So back to the 7 principles that you use as your keys to leadership. Which of those has had the biggest impact on you as you've worked to implement it?
Well, I'm going to answer that with 2 things. So the first one is that in getting clarity of my personal mission, my core values, was helped me immensely because I knew who I was. As I always kid leaders, if you don't stand for something, you're going to fall for everything. So you really having clarity of what your beliefs and that you communicate that clearly. But I think as far as the overall picture is that you have to learn to build trust. And if you don't build trust, then it's going to all go haywire with everything else.
Thank you. So within the 7 skills that you've got listed there, what's the first skill someone from the rising generation? So like, let's say you got a coach that's 25 years old, comes to you, says, I love these skills. What's the first one they should seek to develop?
Well, again, I'm going to answer that because it's a great question to narrow right down. Is that 2 things? I think you have to have care, so you got to fall in love with the people you're coaching, and then the second piece for me is having the passion to want to learn as much about whatever whether it's technology. In my case, it was basketball. So I love basketball. So I was always studying how to teach it, how to, organize a practice, how to run a system, all that stuff. So I think you got to have the ability to be able to teach whatever you're doing. But the huge thing is how do you build relationships? Because who you surround yourself has a lot to do with your success, and you're going to attract. Because when we started to become more and more successful, we attracted the right type of people. Because I always talk to people is that in our program, I believe our players knew we cared about them, but it was not easy to play in our program. We have very high standards. It was not for everyone. But we practiced at 6 o'clock in the morning. So we did things that most of the teams didn't do. But at the same time, our players knew we cared about them deeply, and we spent a lot of time with them. And I can say this: I had one player that played a couple years in the NBA. He's playing in Italy right now. But the greatest compliment I ever received, I was out with him for lunch about 4 years ago with my JV coach that took over for me. He's now the head coach, and his name was Anthony. He said he told my assistant, he says, Coach Setzer, the thing I can tell you about Coach Johnson is why I liked him so much is because I knew that he cared more about me as a person than he did as a basketball player. And that was probably the greatest compliment I ever received from a player.
Well, it's powerful.
What you just described there of somebody, if a young coach or a parent, and anybody, because we're all in leadership positions, we're just either being good leaders or bad leaders, probably. If that was a part of your clarifying vision, the caring, and then having a true love for what you're doing, I think you're going to see a lot of success. So I have one final question for you, Coach.
Yep.
Because this is, the name of our podcast. It's kind of a play on words, and it's the Stop Parenting and Start Coaching podcast. And so many of the principles you have spoken of and have described are exactly what we're encouraging parents to do. But if you had, the world is tough. I know you know this. The world it's a tough place. If you had 30 seconds with a parent of a high school athlete or performer who is really, really struggling with being the parent in today's world, but you only have 30 seconds. Now, I'm not going to time you, Coach. So if you go longer than 30 seconds,
He times me.
it's totally okay. But what would you say to the parent that is, things are not humming along the way they should be humming along? They're really struggling. What would you say to them?
Okay, so first thing would be you have to give them unconditional love. No matter what, you have to love them. Number two is you must be a model. And number three is you have to start spending time with them and build a relationship by communicating them, but more importantly, being a listener. And that's where I think when young people don't feel like they're being listened to, then they lose that big word we've talked about, respect, and then you have breakdown in trust. So I think love them, be a model for them, and then be there for them. Like the best parents that I saw were really good models. They were we over me people, which is easier said than done. They cared deeply about their son. I was a boys basketball coach, but they also had everything in perspective. I'll tell you what, a little quick story. Early in my career at the first degree school, I had two brothers, and they were both decent players. They weren't great players, but they were two of the greatest kids I ever coached. I mean, you talk about just great kids. But you know why? Because they had great parents. And I'll never forget this. We shot free throws days of a game before school. And there was a method to my madness. The madness was that, yes, we were getting some extra reps, but it also made sure every player was going to be on time to school, because otherwise they didn't start if they came late. And I'll give you two illustrations going to my story here. The two brothers came in late, and the one brother was a senior and he was a starter, and he didn't start. And 2 days later, the father came in, and I thought I was going to get, chewed out or whatever, and he said, "Coach, thank you." And I said, "Terry, what are you talking about?" He goes, "My sons learned such a great lesson about expectations and how the importance of being on time. And I'll tell you right, they'll never be late again." And he was correct. They were never late again. But I'll give you one other quick sideline. I mentioned Anthony was the best player I ever coached. His sophomore year, we're playing in the sectional semifinals. He comes in late to our free throws. And I even had the seniors come down and say, "Coach, Anthony's still going to start." And I said, "No, he's not." And it's funny because we had a volunteer assistant that did a lot of work with our players in the off season. They all called him, and he told them the same thing: "Coach isn't going to change. Anthony's not going to start." And sure enough, he didn't start. Now the neat thing is the kid that I put in for him was not nearly as good a player, but he scored our first two baskets, so it did make us look good.
It's always great when it works out like that.
Yeah.
Love it.
That's awesome. Well, Coach, this has been I know for two old coaches, this has been a pure treat. I know this has been great for our listeners. You do so many things. I know there's one place for sure that's kind of a central location where people can find out about your books. And you do have you're working on a new book?
Yeah, we have a new book actually called Lessons from Thought Leaders that I have a chapter in with some pretty notable for if you've heard of Les Brown and Brian Tracy. Zig Ziglar's son Tom has a chapter in it. So it's been kind of a neat book that I was just involved in. We released it in December. So that's my latest thing. In that chapter I talk about my 7 leadership keys. So, but the best way. And you know what? I've been doing this more because I just like to help people. So my website is coachjimjohnson.com, but I'll give you my personal email and cell phone. You'd be glad to share that because I'm not afraid. And I'll give you a quick side story if you don't mind. So I listened to a lot of podcasts, and there was 2 guys that were somewhat famous. They're not super famous, but certainly have some real clout. And they gave their cell phones out. And you know what? I was listening and I called both of them and they were on my podcast. So by giving my number out, I'm fine with it. But it's coachjimjohnson.com. My best personal email is jimjohnson@gmail.com. And my cell phone is 585-764-0220. So if people want to reach out to me, I'm here for them. I want to practice what I preach. So.
Well, I do know you practice what you preach because you gave me your phone number and you have my phone number and you have actually used it. You have used it several times, and that is awesome. We also want our listeners to check out the Limitless Leadership Lounge podcast. It's really amazing, and your guests are fantastic. I also am going to make a little plug because I know that you are, for that podcast, you are trying to grow your presence on YouTube. And so people can find that on YouTube. So go to the Limitless Leadership Lounge, as well as the Stop Parenting and Start Coaching podcast.
Absolutely.
And subscribe to those two shows. We would really appreciate you if you did that. Nate, you have the final word with Coach.
Coach, this is incredible for me. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and put a face and a personality to an experience that inspired me as a coach. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for touching my heart today. Thank you for sharing your leadership principles and the wisdom that you've put the time and effort into accumulating over the years. And I know you've made an impact on our listeners as well. So thank you so much for being here with us today. If parents can apply these leadership principles to their parenting, they're going to build the connection with their kids that will help their kids to overcome any situation they might be in. It's not about winning games. It's about changing lives. And you have lived that for decades. And we very much appreciate you being here with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Nate and Steve. I've enjoyed it immensely and really hope we get a chance to meet in person. So.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Nate Crandall and Steve Gallagher would like to thank you for tuning in to this episode. If you love what you're experiencing and learning from the Stop Parenting and Start Coaching podcast, please like, comment, and or leave a glowing review of this episode and the show. And to further help Nate and Steve expand their reach and impact thousands of parents, athletes, and performers, please share the show and subscribe to the Stop Parenting and Start Coaching podcast channel on YouTube. And if you want to explore further to see what Nate and Steve are creating to help parents of athletes and performers everywhere, please visit their website at createtransformbecome.com. That's createtransformbecome, all one word, .com. There you will find a growing number of tools and resources to help you elevate your parenting. Thanks again for tuning in. Now go create a magical relationship with your athlete or performer.